The burgundy paper felt rough between Camille's fingers as she stared at the name tag in complete disbelief. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. The elegant calligraphy that had been so carefully crafted for every other guest mocked her with its cruel simplicity. Housekeeper. Not Camille Johnson, beloved daughter-in-law. Not Camille, sister-in-law of the bride. Just housekeeper. She stood frozen in the ornate hotel lobby, watching other family members laugh and embrace while pinning their properly labeled tags to expensive dresses and tailored suits. Each tag bore their names with love and respect. Mother of the bride. Uncle Robert. Cousin Patricia. But hers? Housekeeper. 10 years. 10 years of marriage to Richard Johnson. 10 years of hosting every holiday dinner in their home because Camille cooks so well. 10 years of organizing family gatherings, remembering birthdays, buying gifts, and playing the perfect wife. 10 years of being the glue that held his scattered family together. And this was how they saw her. The wedding planner approached with a bright smile, completely unaware of the bomb she was about to drop. "Oh, Mrs. Johnson. There you are. I have your name tag ready." She handed over the burgundy paper with the same cheerful efficiency she'd shown everyone else. Camille's hands shook as she read it again, hoping she'd misunderstood. But the letters remained stubbornly clear. Housekeeper. Not even her name. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter of arriving guests. The wedding planner checked her clipboard with practiced efficiency. "Let me see. Camille Johnson. Yes, that's correct." The mother of the bride specifically requested that designation for the seating charts and name tags. The world tilted on its axis. The mother of the bride. Her mother-in-law, Patricia Johnson. The woman who'd smiled at her across countless dinner tables, who'd hugged her at Christmas mornings, who'd called her daughter in front of friends. That same woman had deliberately labeled her as nothing more than hired help. Camille's eyes swept the lobby until they found Patricia standing near the elevator, resplendent in navy blue silk and genuine pearls. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her smile radiant as she greeted relatives. She looked every inch the proud mother of the bride, basking in the attention and compliments. As if sensing Camille's stare, Patricia turned. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and something cold and calculating flickered across the older woman's features. Not embarrassment. Not guilt. Satisfaction. A small, cruel smile tugged at the corners of Patricia's mouth before she turned back to her conversation, dismissing Camille as easily as one might ignore a piece of furniture. The message was crystal clear. After 10 years of marriage, after countless family dinners where Camille had served Patricia's favorite dishes, after years of listening to her complaints about other family members, after being the one Patricia called when she was lonely or needed someone to drive her to appointments, this was how she truly saw her. As nothing more than a housekeeper. Camille felt something deep inside her chest crack. Not break entirely but fracture like glass under pressure. The sound of laughter around her became distant and muffled, as if she were underwater. The expensive floral arrangements that filled the lobby seemed to mock her with their beauty, their perfection arranged by someone who was probably paid better and treated with more respect than she was. She thought about all the times she'd defended Patricia to Richard when he complained about his mother's demands. All the time she'd bitten her tongue when Patricia made subtle digs about her background, her education, her career. All the time she'd convinced herself that Patricia was just old-fashioned, that she meant well, that family was worth the occasional discomfort. But this wasn't old-fashioned. This was deliberate cruelty. The name tag trembled in her hands as the full weight of the insult settled over her. She wasn't just being disrespected, she was being erased. Reduced to a function rather than recognized as a person, as family, as someone who mattered. Other guests continued to flow around her like water around a stone, their conversations a blur of excitement about the upcoming ceremony. Someone brushed past her, murmuring an apology, but Camille barely registered it. She was trapped in a bubble of shock and humiliation, staring at the two words that had just shattered her understanding of her place in this family. The hotel's air conditioning hummed overhead, but she felt flushed and dizzy. Her carefully chosen dress, a beautiful emerald green that Richard had complimented that morning, suddenly felt like a costume. She'd spent hours getting ready, wanting to look perfect for her sister-in-law's special day. She'd even bought new shoes that pinched her feet because they matched her outfit perfectly. All for this. All to be labeled as hired help. Behind her, she heard Richard's voice calling her name. "Camille. There you are. I've been looking everywhere." His footsteps approached, and she could picture him in his charcoal gray suit, probably looking handsome and relaxed, completely unaware that his family had just delivered the ultimate insult to his wife. She couldn't turn around. Not yet. If she faced him now, if she saw his clueless smile and heard him ask why she wasn't wearing her name tag, she might break completely. And she refused to give Patricia Johnson the satisfaction of seeing her crumble in a hotel lobby full of witnesses. The name tag felt heavier than it should, like it was made of lead instead of paper. Such a small thing to carry such devastating weight. 2 words that had just changed everything. Camille closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The hurt was still there, sharp and fresh, but underneath it was something else. Something harder and more dangerous. Clarity. For the first time in 10 years, she saw her marriage, her in-laws, and her life with perfect, brutal clarity. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was exactly how they saw her, and they'd finally stopped pretending otherwise. The question now was what she planned to do about it. Camille. Richard's voice carried that edge of impatience she'd learned to recognize over the years. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. She turned slowly, the name tag still clutched in her hand. Richard stood before her in his perfectly pressed suit, his dark hair styled just so, looking every inch the successful businessman he was. But for the first time in 10 years, she didn't see the man she'd fallen in love with. She saw Patricia's son. Your mother, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, had me labeled as the housekeeper. Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? She held up the burgundy paper, watching his face carefully. My name tag. Instead of Camille Johnson, or sister-in-law of the bride, it says housekeeper. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely puzzled. Then his expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise, embarrassment, and finally, something that looked uncomfortably like resignation. Oh, well, you know how Mom is. She probably didn't mean anything by it. The words hit her like a physical blow. Not anger at his mother's cruelty. Not outrage on his wife's behalf. Just dismissal. Acceptance. As if this was perfectly normal behavior that she should simply tolerate. She didn't mean anything by it? Camille's voice remained quiet, but something in her tone made Richard step back slightly. She specifically told the wedding planner to label me as hired help. At your sister's wedding. In front of your entire family. Look, I'll talk to her after the ceremony, okay? She's probably just stressed about the wedding. You know how she gets when she's planning events. The casual way he brushed off her humiliation was somehow worse than the name tag itself. This was her husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect her, and he was asking her to simply swallow this insult for the sake of family peace. I've been planning events for this family for 10 years, she said, her voice growing stronger. I've cooked every holiday meal, organized every birthday party, and remembered every anniversary. I've listened to your mother complain about her neighbors, her health, her finances. I've driven her to doctor appointments and helped her grocery shop. And this is how she sees me. Richard glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. Can we please not do this here? Sarah's wedding is about to start. We can talk about this later. Sarah. His sister, the bride, who'd called Camille exactly twice in the past year. Both times to ask for help with wedding planning. Sarah, who'd smiled sweetly while Camille addressed hundreds of wedding invitations by hand because, your handwriting is so much prettier than mine. Sarah, who'd undoubtedly known about the name tag situation and said nothing. No, Camille said simply. We can't talk about this later. Something in her tone finally penetrated Richard's distraction. He looked at her more carefully, taking in her rigid posture, the way she held herself like she was preparing for battle. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Camille walked toward the hotel's gift shop, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Richard followed, his confusion evident. She purchased a small pair of scissors from the bored teenager behind the counter, ignoring his questioning stare. Back in the lobby, she sat down in one of the plush chairs and began cutting the name tag into tiny pieces. Each snip was deliberate, methodical. The burgundy paper fell like confetti onto the expensive carpet. What are you doing? Richard's voice had risen slightly, drawing attention from nearby guests. I'm making a choice, she replied calmly, continuing to cut. For 10 years, I've chosen to ignore the little comments, the subtle insults, the way your family treats me like I'm not quite good enough. I've chosen to smile and play along because I thought it would get better. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was more helpful, more accommodating, they'd eventually accept me. The last piece of the name tag fluttered to the floor. Camille set the scissors aside and stood up, brushing invisible dust from her dress. But they never intended to accept me. This name tag isn't a mistake or a moment of stress. It's exactly how your mother sees me, and you just confirmed that you're okay with that. That's not fair, Richard protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Camille reached into her purse and pulled out her wedding ring. The diamond caught the lobby's crystal chandelier light, sending tiny rainbows across the walls. When was the last time you stood up for me? When was the last time you told your mother that her comments about my cooking, my cleaning, my career were inappropriate? When was the last time you made it clear that I'm your wife, not your employee? Richard's face paled. Camille, you're being dramatic. It's just a name tag. You're right. It is just a name tag. She slipped the ring off her finger, the motion smooth and final. But it's also a symbol of 10 years of being taken for granted. 10 years of being treated like hired help while being expected to work for free. The ring felt strangely light in her palm. Such a small thing to represent so much history, so many broken promises. She'd loved this ring once, loved what it represented. Now it felt like a chain she'd finally learned to unlock. What are you doing? Richard reached for her hand, but she stepped back. I'm done, she said simply. I'm done pretending that this is normal. I'm done making excuses for your family's behavior. I'm done being the unpaid housekeeper who's grateful for whatever scraps of respect you throw my way. The lobby had grown quieter around them. Other guests sensed the tension and were doing their best to pretend they weren't listening while hanging on every word. Camille could see Patricia across the room, her face rigid with anger as she realized what was happening. You can't just leave, Richard said desperately. What about the wedding? What about our marriage? The wedding will go on without me. Your family will probably be relieved. She placed the ring in his palm, closing his fingers around it. As for our marriage, I think this name tag says everything we need to know about where we stand. She turned toward the elevator, her head held high despite the tears threatening to fall. Behind her, she heard Richard calling her name, heard the whispered conversations starting among the guests. But she didn't look back. The elevator doors opened like a portal to freedom. As they closed behind her, she caught one last glimpse of the lobby. Patricia was hurrying toward Richard, her face a mask of fury and panic. Other family members were clustering around them, their voices rising in agitation. But Camille was already gone, ascending toward something she hadn't felt in 10 years, the possibility of being valued for who she was rather than what she could do for others. The silence in the elevator was deafening, but for the first time in a decade, it felt like peace. The apartment felt different when Camille walked through the door. The same beige walls, the same furniture she'd carefully chosen to please Richard's traditional tastes, the same family photos that suddenly seemed to mock her with their false intimacy. But something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer seeing her home. She was seeing the stage where she'd performed the role of perfect wife for 10 years. Her phone buzzed constantly. Richard's name flashed on the screen again and again, followed by texts from his sister, his mother, even his Uncle Robert. She turned it off and set it aside. For the first time in her adult life, she owed no one an explanation. The silence was strange. She'd grown so accustomed to the constant demands, the endless phone calls asking for favors, the expectation that she would always be available. Now, in the quiet of her own space, she could finally hear herself think. She walked to the kitchen where she'd spent countless hours preparing meals for people who saw her as nothing more than a servant. The expensive pots and pans Richard had bought her for Christmas, practical gifts that ensured she could better serve his family, suddenly looked like instruments of her own imprisonment. The refrigerator was stocked with groceries for the dinner party she'd planned for next week. Patricia's bridge club was supposed to come over, and Camille had already planned the menu around everyone's dietary restrictions. She'd even bought special flowers for the centerpiece because Patricia mentioned liking yellow roses. Not anymore. Camille opened the refrigerator and began removing items systematically. The expensive steaks meant for the bridge club went into a bag. The imported cheese, the organic vegetables, the wine she'd selected specifically for Patricia's palate, all of it was donated to her neighbor, an elderly woman who'd always been kind to her. Are you having a party? Mrs. Chin asked, accepting the bags with surprised gratitude. No, Camille replied. I'm just done cooking for people who don't appreciate it. The older woman's eyes were knowing. Good for you, dear. Sometimes the best gift we can give ourselves is to stop giving everything away. Back in the apartment, Camille continued her methodical dismantling of the life she'd built around other people's expectations. She went through the closet, separating clothes into categories, items she'd bought because Richard liked them, outfits chosen to impress his family, and the few pieces she'd actually chosen for herself. The pile of clothes chosen for others was surprisingly large. Conservative dresses in colors that looked appropriate for family functions. Cardigans that covered her arms because Patricia had once mentioned that sleeveless tops were too casual for family gatherings. Shoes that matched everything but expressed nothing about her personality. She folded these items carefully and placed them in donation bags. Not out of respect for the clothes themselves, but because the act of folding, of organizing, of making deliberate choices about what to keep and what to release, felt like meditation. Each garment represented a small decision to prioritize herself over others' opinions. The family photos were next. Wedding pictures where she looked radiant and hopeful, holiday gatherings where she was always the one serving while others sat comfortably, vacation photos where she was inevitably the one taking the pictures rather than being in them. She removed every photo that showed her performing rather than living. Her phone, still turned off, seemed to pulse with unheard messages. She could imagine Richard's growing panic as his calls went unanswered. She could picture Patricia's fury at being defied. The thought should have made her feel guilty, but instead, it filled her with a quiet satisfaction. They were experiencing, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of their actions. For 10 years, Camille had absorbed their thoughtlessness, their casual cruelty, their assumption that she would always be available to clean up their messes. Now they were discovering what life looked like without her constant accommodation. She found the financial documents in Richard's desk drawer. Their joint bank account showed the usual pattern. Richard's salary flowing in and money flowing out for family obligations. Patricia's birthday dinner at the expensive restaurant she'd chosen. Sarah's wedding gift that had cost more than Camille's monthly grocery budget. The emergency loan to Richard's brother that had never been repaid. But there was something else. A pattern she'd never noticed before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. Regular transfers to an account she didn't recognize. Substantial amounts, always on the same day of the month. She traced the pattern back 6 months, finding the same transfer again and again. Her fingers trembled as she logged into their online banking and researched the account number. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The transfers were going to an account belonging to Vanessa Torres, a woman who worked in Richard's office. A woman whose name had come up in casual conversation over the past year, always with Richard emphasizing how professional their relationship was. The amounts were significant. Not just lunch money or small gifts, but substantial sums that spoke of an ongoing relationship. An apartment rental payment. Credit card bills. The kinds of expenses that suggested Richard was supporting another woman's lifestyle. Camille sat back in the chair, staring at the computer screen. The name tag at the wedding had been cruel, but this was devastating. Not only had Richard's family reduced her to a servant, but Richard himself had been living a double life, using their joint finances to support another woman while his wife played housekeeper to his family. The betrayal was complete. She wasn't just unappreciated, she was being actively deceived. The money she'd helped earn through her own career, the savings she'd contributed to their joint account, was being used to fund her husband's affair. But instead of the crushing despair she might have expected, Camille felt something else entirely. Relief. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. She wasn't imagining the disrespect, wasn't being overly sensitive, wasn't failing to appreciate her family's love. She was simply being used, and now she had proof. She printed out the bank statements and placed them in a folder. Then she did something she'd never done before. She opened her own individual bank account. The process was surprisingly simple, and the bank representative was friendly and professional, treating her like a valued customer rather than an inconvenience. "Will this be a joint account?" the woman asked. "No," Camille replied firmly. "This is just for me." The words felt revolutionary. Just for me. How long had it been since she'd had anything that was just for her? She transferred half of their joint savings to her new account. It was legally hers, earned through her own work and saved through her own careful budgeting. Richard would discover the transfer eventually, but by then she'd be long gone. The apartment felt lighter as she continued her careful dismantling. She wasn't running away in panic. She was making deliberate choices about what kind of life she wanted to build. For the first time in 10 years, she was putting herself first. The sun was setting by the time she finished. The apartment looked strangely empty, not because she'd taken much, but because she'd removed all traces of the performance she'd been giving. What remained was neutral, clean, and utterly without personality. It looked exactly like what it was. A space where someone had been living a lie. She packed a single suitcase with the clothes she'd chosen for herself, the books Richard had never understood her need to read, and the few personal items that brought her genuine joy. Everything else could stay. She was done carrying other people's expectations. At the door, she paused for one last look. 10 years of her life had been spent in this space, trying to become someone else's version of the perfect wife. Now she was leaving to discover who she might become when she was only accountable to herself. The silence followed her out, but now it felt like an old friend. Richard's phone buzzed for the 15th time in an hour. He ignored it, just as he'd been ignoring the growing pile of problems that had appeared since Camille's dramatic exit from the wedding 3 weeks ago. The caller ID showed his mother's name, and he already knew what she wanted. "Richard, you need to do something about this situation immediately." Patricia's voice was sharp with panic when he finally answered. "The bridge club is supposed to meet here tomorrow, and I haven't heard from Camille about the arrangements." "Mom, I told you. She's not coming back. She's staying at her sister's place and she won't take my calls." "That's ridiculous. She's your wife. Make her come home." The words hung in the air, highlighting a fundamental misunderstanding that Richard was only beginning to grasp. His mother spoke as if Camille were a possession that could be commanded rather than a person who had made a choice. "It's not that simple," he said, rubbing his temples where a headache had been building for days. "She's hired a divorce attorney." The silence on the other end was deafening. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was strained. "She can't be serious. Where would she even get the money for a lawyer?" Richard had been wondering the same thing until he checked their joint account that morning. Half their savings were gone, transferred to an account he couldn't access. The discovery had been both shocking and, if he was honest, somewhat impressive. His quiet, accommodating wife had been planning her exit more carefully than he'd realized. "She took half the savings," he admitted. "It's legally hers, so there's nothing I can do about it." "This is insane." Patricia's voice rose to a near shriek. "After everything we've done for her, after how welcome we've made her feel in this family, this is how she repays us?" Richard almost laughed at the bitter irony. "Welcome." The name tag incident had been cruel, but it was only the most recent example of years of subtle dismissal. He'd been blind to it, or perhaps willfully ignorant, because acknowledging it would have required him to stand up to his family. It had been easier to let Camille absorb their thoughtlessness and convince himself that she was being overly sensitive. "She's canceled the bridge club meeting," he said. "She called Mrs. Patterson directly to explain that she wouldn't be hosting anymore." "She what?" Patricia's outrage was palpable. "She can't just cancel my bridge club. We've been meeting at your house for 3 years. It's not her responsibility anymore, Mom. She doesn't live here." The apartment felt different without Camille's presence. Not just empty but somehow wrong. The silence was oppressive rather than peaceful. He'd grown accustomed to the sounds of her moving through the space, the gentle hum of her presence that had made the place feel like a home rather than just a space. Now he was discovering how much invisible work she'd been doing. The refrigerator was nearly empty because she'd always been the one to grocery shop. The laundry was piling up because she'd handled that too. The bills were in chaos because she'd been the one to organize and pay them. He'd never realized how much of their life she'd been managing until she was gone. "You need to fix this," Patricia demanded. "Talk to her. Apologize. Do whatever it takes to get her back." "I've tried. She won't see me." "Then try harder. This is your marriage, Richard. You can't just let her walk away." But even as his mother spoke, Richard was beginning to understand that Camille hadn't just walked away from their marriage. She'd walked away from a life where she was undervalued and taken for granted. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't honestly say she was wrong to do so. After ending the call with his mother, Richard found himself wandering through the apartment, seeing it through new eyes. The kitchen where Camille had prepared countless meals for his family, never sitting down to eat with them because she was too busy serving. The living room where she'd hosted holidays, always in the background ensuring everyone else's comfort. The bedroom where she'd listened to his complaints about work while managing her own career and household responsibilities. He'd taken her for granted so completely that he'd never stopped to consider what she might need or want. When had he last asked about her day? When had he last supported her goals or celebrated her achievements? He couldn't remember, and that realization was devastating. His phone rang again. This time it was his sister Sarah, calling from her honeymoon. "Richard, what's this about Camille leaving you? Mom called me in tears." "She walked out at your wedding," he said. "She saw the name tag." "What name tag?" "The one that said, Housekeeper, instead of her name." There was a long pause. "Oh, that. You knew about it?" "Mom mentioned it when we were going over the seating arrangements. She said it was more accurate since Camille always ends up doing all the work anyway." The casual cruelty of it hit him again. His mother and sister had discussed reducing his wife to a job title, and both had thought it was appropriate. No wonder Camille had left. Sarah, she's my wife. She's been part of this family for 10 years. I know that, but you have to admit she's always been more comfortable in the background. She's not really the type to make small talk with the relatives. She's not comfortable in the background, Richard said, the words coming out more sharply than he'd intended. She's been pushed there. There's a difference. You're being dramatic. She's probably just having some sort of breakdown. Women her age do that sometimes. Women her age. As if Camille were some generic middle-aged woman rather than a specific person with feelings and experiences. As if her departure were a symptom of hormones rather than a rational response to years of disrespect. She's 34, Sarah. And she's not having a breakdown. She's making a choice. Whatever. She'll come back. She always does. But Richard was beginning to understand that this time was different. Camille had been absorbing their family's thoughtlessness for years, making excuses for their behavior, convincing herself that love meant accepting whatever scraps of respect they offered. The name tag had been the final straw, but it wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that she'd spent 10 years being treated like hired help, and he'd let it happen. Over the next few days, the full scope of Camille's departure became clear. She'd systematically removed herself from every obligation she'd taken on for his family. Patricia's bridge club was cancelled indefinitely. The monthly family dinners were no longer happening. The birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and social gatherings that had been effortlessly organized for years were suddenly no one's responsibility. His family's reactions ranged from confusion to anger to panic. They'd grown so accustomed to Camille's invisible labor that they'd forgotten it was labor at all. Now they were discovering what it felt like to manage their own social calendars, cook their own meals, and handle their own problems. She's being vindictive, Patricia complained during one of her increasingly frequent phone calls. She's punishing all of us because of a silly misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Richard said. It was exactly what you intended. I don't know what's gotten into you, his mother snapped. You're talking about me as if I'm some sort of monster. I'm talking about you as if you deliberately humiliated my wife at your daughter's wedding, which is exactly what you did. The conversation ended with Patricia hanging up on him, but Richard felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time in his adult life, he'd chosen his wife's dignity over his family's comfort. It was years too late to save his marriage, but it was something. He looked around the empty apartment and tried to imagine what life might have been like if he'd made different choices. If he'd stood up for Camille when his family made their subtle digs. If he'd valued her contributions instead of taking them for granted. If he'd seen her as a partner rather than a service provider. But it was too late for hypotheticals. Camille was gone, and she'd taken with her everything that had made their house a home. What remained was the echo of wasted opportunities and the growing realization that he'd lost something irreplaceable. The silence in the apartment was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the silence of his phone. For the first time in 10 years, no one was calling to ask for Camille's help. The coffee shop in downtown Seattle buzzed with the energy of people pursuing their own dreams. Camille sat at a corner table, her laptop open, working on the proposal that would either launch her consulting business or confirm that she'd made a terrible mistake. 3 weeks had passed since she'd walked out of Sarah's wedding, and she was finally beginning to remember who she'd been before she became Richard's wife. Her sister Tanya slid into the seat across from her, carrying 2 steaming cups and wearing the concerned expression that had become familiar over the past weeks. "How's the business plan coming along?" Tanya asked, settling into her chair. "Better than expected," Camille replied, closing the laptop. "I forgot how much I enjoyed strategic planning when it wasn't for someone else's benefit." For 10 years, Camille had used her business skills to organize Richard's family life, plan their social events, and manage their household logistics. She'd been so focused on applying her talents to their needs that she'd forgotten she had other options. Now, for the first time since college, she was thinking about what she wanted to build for herself. "I've been thinking about your offer," Camille said, stirring her coffee. "The freelance consulting work. I'd like to take it." Tanya's face lit up. "Really? The nonprofit is desperate for someone with your skills. They've been trying to organize their donor database for months." "I want to do more than just organize databases," Camille said, feeling a spark of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. "I want to help organizations actually grow. Strategic planning, resource allocation, systems design. The kind of work that makes a real difference." "You mean the kind of work you're actually trained for?" Camille laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "Exactly. I have a master's degree in organizational development, and I've been using it to plan bridge club meetings. The realization wasn't bitter anymore. It was simply true, and acknowledging it felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. She'd been so focused on being the perfect wife that she'd forgotten she was also a capable professional with her own ambitions. I've been in touch with 3 different organizations, she continued. A women's shelter that needs help with their intake process, a community center that wants to expand their programming, and a small business incubator that needs strategic planning support. That's amazing, Tanya said. You sound like yourself again. The comment caught Camille off guard. What do you mean? You sound like the sister I grew up with, the one who used to reorganize her entire room just for the satisfaction of improving the system. The one who planned our family vacations so efficiently that we never had a single scheduling conflict. You sound excited about your own life. Camille considered this as she sipped her coffee. When had she stopped being excited about her own life? Somewhere along the way, she'd become so focused on supporting Richard's goals and managing his family's needs that she'd forgotten she had goals of her own. I met with the divorce attorney yesterday, she said, changing the subject. The financial separation is more straightforward than I expected. How are you feeling about all of that? Relieved, Camille said, surprised by the honesty of her own answer. I thought I'd be devastated, but mostly I feel free. Like I can finally breathe. The divorce proceedings had revealed the extent of Richard's financial infidelity. The transfers to Vanessa Torres's account were clearly documented, and Camille's attorney had been straightforward about the implications. He's been using joint funds to support another woman, the lawyer had explained. That strengthens your position considerably. But Camille hadn't felt the rage she'd expected. Instead, she felt validated. The affair wasn't her fault, and it wasn't something she could have prevented by being a better wife. It was simply confirmation that she'd been living with someone who didn't value her. Have you heard from Richard? Tanya asked carefully. He's been calling, but I'm not ready to talk to him yet. Maybe I never will be. Camille pulled out her phone and showed Tanya the string of missed calls and unread messages. He's also been trying to reach me through mutual friends. What's he saying? The usual. That he's sorry, that he wants to work things out, that his family misses me. Camille's voice was flat. He's even offered to go to counseling. That's something, isn't it? It's 10 years too late. Camille put her phone away. I spent a decade waiting for him to stand up for me, to value me, to see me as more than a convenient solution to his family's problems. Now that I'm gone, he wants to change. But I'm not interested in going backward. The truth was, Camille had been thinking about Richard's messages, but not in the way he might hope. Each apologetic text, each voicemail promising to do better, only reinforced her decision to leave. Where had this concern for her feelings been when his mother was making cutting remarks about her cooking? Where had this desire to work on their relationship been when she was organizing his family's social calendar for free? I think I'm going to look for my own apartment, she said. I love staying with you, but I need to rebuild my life, not just hide from the old one. You're not hiding, Tanya said firmly. You're healing. There's a difference. I know. But I'm ready for the next step. They spent the rest of the afternoon looking at apartment listings on Camille's laptop. She wanted something small but bright, something that felt like hers rather than a compromise between her preferences and someone else's. After years of living in spaces designed to accommodate Richard's traditional tastes and impress his family, she was looking forward to choosing her own colors, her own furniture, her own life. What about this one? Tanya pointed to a listing for a 1-bedroom apartment with large windows and a small balcony. It's in Capitol Hill, walking distance to great restaurants and that bookstore you love. Camille studied the photos. The apartment was smaller than the home she'd shared with Richard, but it looked bright and peaceful. The kitchen was compact but functional, perfect for someone who wanted to cook for pleasure rather than obligation. The living room had built-in bookshelves that made her heart skip with excitement. I love it, she said. I want to see it tomorrow. Really? Just like that. Just like that. Camille closed the laptop with a decisive snap. I'm done overthinking every decision. I'm done seeking approval for my choices. If I like it, that's reason enough. The apartment viewing the next day confirmed her instincts. The space was everything she'd hoped for, bright, quiet, and completely her own. The landlord was a middle-aged woman who seemed more interested in finding a responsible tenant than in Camille's personal drama. I'll take it, Camille said before they'd even finished the tour. Don't you want to think about it? Discuss it with your husband? I'm getting divorced, Camille said simply. And I don't need to think about it. This is exactly what I want. The woman smiled. Good for you. When can you move in? Next week. Walking back to her car, Camille felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She was making decisions based on what she wanted rather than what would please others. She was building a life that belonged entirely to her. For the first time since college, she was excited about the future. Her phone buzzed with another message from Richard. This time, instead of ignoring it, she read it. "Camille, please call me. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. I love you." The message might have moved her once, but now it just seemed empty. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice that was demonstrated through actions. Richard had chosen his family's comfort over her dignity for 10 years. He'd chosen to keep secrets and live a double life rather than address their problems honestly. His declaration of love now felt like too little, too late. She deleted the message without responding and drove home to start packing for her new life. Tomorrow she would be signing the lease on her own apartment. Next week she would be moving into a space that was entirely hers. Next month she would be launching her consulting business. For the first time in a decade, the future felt full of possibilities rather than obligations. She was finally free to discover who she might become when she was only accountable to herself. The discovery happened by accident, the way most devastating truths do. Camille was sorting through the last of her belongings at the apartment she'd shared with Richard, focusing on the final items in their shared home office. She'd been methodical about the separation, taking only what was clearly hers and leaving everything else behind. But buried in the bottom drawer of the desk was a folder she'd never seen before. Inside were credit card statements for an account she didn't know existed. The charges painted a clear picture of Richard's double life. Expensive dinners at romantic restaurants she'd never been to, hotel rooms during times when he'd claimed to be working late, jewelry purchases that had never made their way to her. But it was the recurring monthly charges that made her stomach drop. Rent payments for an apartment across town. Utilities. A storage unit. The infrastructure of a second life, carefully hidden and systematically maintained. She sat back in the desk chair, staring at the evidence of betrayal that went far deeper than she'd initially understood. The financial support for Vanessa Torres hadn't been the impulsive actions of a man having a midlife crisis. It had been a calculated deception, sustained over more than a year. The dates on the statements told the story. The apartment rental had begun 15 months ago, right around the time Richard had started mentioning Vanessa's name in casual conversation. The same period when he'd begun working late more frequently, taking weekend business trips that seemed to accomplish very little. Camille felt a strange sense of relief mixed with her anger. She'd spent months wondering if she'd overreacted to the name tag incident, if she'd been too sensitive about his family's treatment of her. Now she understood that the disrespect had been complete. While she'd been playing the perfect wife, hosting his family's gatherings and managing his household, he'd been building an entirely separate life with another woman. Her phone rang, Richard's name appearing on the screen. For the first time in weeks she answered. "Camille, thank God." His voice was filled with relief. "I've been so worried about you. Can we please talk? I know we can work this out." "I found the credit card statements," she said calmly. The silence that followed was answer enough. She could picture him in the empty apartment, realizing that his carefully constructed lies were falling apart. "I can explain," he said finally, his voice smaller. "I'm sure you can. You've been paying for Vanessa's apartment for over a year. You've been living a double life while I've been playing housekeeper to your family. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. You've been supporting another woman financially while your wife cooked for your mother's bridge club. Camille, please, let me come see you. Let me explain what happened." "I don't want an explanation," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I want you to understand something. When I left your sister's wedding, I thought I was responding to your family's disrespect. I thought the name tag was the worst thing I'd discovered about my marriage. It was a mistake. My mother didn't mean—" "Stop," she interrupted. "I'm not calling to discuss your mother's intentions. I'm calling to tell you that I'm done. Completely done. The divorce papers will be served next week." "You can't mean that." "I absolutely mean it. I've spent 10 years making excuses for your family's behavior and your inability to stand up for me. I've spent 10 years being grateful for whatever scraps of respect you threw my way. But I won't spend another day pretending that any of this is normal or acceptable." She could hear him crying, and for a moment she felt the flicker of the old compassion that had kept her trapped for so long. But then she looked at the credit card statements again, at the systematic deception they represented, and her resolve strengthened. "I'm not angry anymore," she said, and realized it was true. "I'm just done. Done with being taken for granted, done with being disrespected, done with being lied to. I'm going to build a life where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can do for others. I love you, Richard said desperately. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. If this is how you love someone, then I don't want your love. She hung up and turned off the phone. The conversation had been necessary, but it had also been final. There was no going back from this, no possibility of reconciliation. Richard had made his choices and now she was making hers. The apartment felt different as she finished packing. Not like a home she was leaving, but like a costume she was finally taking off. She played a role here for 10 years, and now she was free to discover who she might be when she wasn't performing for an audience that didn't value her. She drove to her new apartment as the sun was setting, her car packed with the few possessions she'd chosen to keep. The space was empty but full of possibility. She walked through the rooms, imagining how she would arrange them, what colors she would choose, what kind of life she would build. For the first time in a decade she was starting fresh. No expectations to meet, no family dynamics to navigate, no lies to pretend she didn't see. Just clean, bright spaces waiting to be filled with her own choices. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the floor in her empty living room, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow she would buy furniture chosen for her own comfort rather than to impress others. Next week she would start her consulting business. Next month she would have built a life that belonged entirely to her. The silence in the apartment was profound, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. 3 months after the wedding, the Johnson family was discovering what life looked like without Camille's invisible labor. Patricia stood in her kitchen, staring at the chaos of her failed attempt to host the bridge club meeting she'd finally rescheduled. The roast was overcooked, the vegetables were mushy, and her guests had already started making polite excuses to leave early. I don't understand how she made it look so easy, Patricia muttered to her daughter Sarah, who was helping with the dishes. I've been cooking for 40 years. Maybe because she actually planned the meals instead of just throwing something together an hour before people arrived, Sarah replied, scrubbing a burnt pan with more force than necessary. The comment stung because it was true. Patricia had never appreciated the hours of preparation that went into Camille's seemingly effortless entertaining. The menu planning, the grocery shopping, the timing of courses, the attention to guests' dietary restrictions, all of it had been invisible to her until she tried to recreate it. She's being vindictive, Patricia said, not for the first time. She's punishing all of us because of one silly misunderstanding. Mom, stop calling it a misunderstanding. You deliberately labeled her as the housekeeper. We all saw it. I didn't mean anything by it. Yes, you did. You meant to put her in her place and it backfired spectacularly. Patricia's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She'd spent months trying to convince herself that Camille's departure was an overreaction, that given time, her daughter-in-law would come to her senses and return to the family. But as the weeks passed and the practical consequences of Camille's absence became impossible to ignore, Patricia was being forced to confront the reality of what she'd lost. The family reunion is next month, Sarah said, drying her hands on a dish towel. Who's going to organize it? I thought you could handle it. I have a new baby and a full-time job. Camille spent months planning those reunions. She handled the venue, the catering, the accommodations for out-of-town relatives. I wouldn't even know where to start. The reunion had been an annual tradition for 15 years, always hosted by Richard and Camille because they had the largest house and because Camille had the organizational skills to coordinate 50 family members from across the country. Now, with Camille gone, the entire event was in jeopardy. What about Richard? Patricia asked. He could organize it. Sarah laughed bitterly. Richard can barely manage his own laundry now that Camille isn't there to do it for him. He's been living on takeout and wearing wrinkled shirts to work. Indeed, Richard's life had fallen apart without Camille's support. His apartment was a disaster, his bills were in chaos, and his work performance was suffering. He'd always relied on Camille to manage the domestic aspects of their life, never realizing how much mental and emotional labor she'd been carrying. Maybe we should just cancel the reunion, Patricia said reluctantly. We can't cancel it. Uncle Robert is flying in from Florida, and Cousin Margaret is driving up from California. The whole family is expecting it. Then what do you suggest? Sarah set down the dish towel and looked at her mother directly. I suggest you call Camille and apologize. Really apologize. Not the half-hearted excuse you've been giving everyone else, but an actual acknowledgement of what you did wrong. I'm not going to grovel to someone who walked out on this family. She didn't walk out on the family. She walked out on being treated like hired help by the family. The distinction was important, though Patricia was reluctant to acknowledge it. Camille hadn't rejected them as people. She'd rejected the role they'd forced her into. She'd refused to continue being the unpaid coordinator of their social lives while being treated as less than a full family member. "Fine," Patricia said finally. "I'll call her." But when she tried, the number went straight to voicemail. Camille had changed her phone number, effectively cutting off all contact with the Johnson family. The realization that she couldn't even reach her former daughter-in-law was somehow more devastating than Patricia had expected. Meanwhile, Richard's attempts to win Camille back were becoming increasingly desperate. He'd driven by her new apartment building several times, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. He'd called her office, only to be told that she was no longer employed there. He'd even reached out to her sister, who'd been politely but firmly unhelpful. "She's doing well," Tanya had told him during their brief phone conversation. "She's starting her own consulting business and seems very happy. I need to talk to her. I need to explain what happened. Richard, she doesn't want to talk to you. She's moved on. She can't have moved on that quickly. We were married for 10 years. 10 years of her giving everything and getting very little in return. She's not mourning the end of that arrangement." The conversation had ended with Tanya hanging up on him, leaving Richard to face the growing realization that his marriage was truly over. Camille wasn't having a temporary breakdown or making a dramatic gesture. She was building a new life that didn't include him. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, served by a professional process server who was courteous but firm. Richard stared at the documents, seeing his marriage reduced to legal language and financial calculations. The terms were fair but final, a clean break with no possibility of reconciliation. "She's really doing this," he said to his empty apartment, the words echoing in the silence that had become his constant companion. His family's reaction to the divorce papers was a mixture of shock and denial. They'd convinced themselves that Camille would eventually come to her senses and return to her role as the family's organizational backbone. The legal documentation of her permanent departure forced them to confront the reality they'd been avoiding. "Maybe it's for the best," his Uncle Robert said during one of their increasingly strained family dinners. "If she's going to be this difficult, maybe Richard is better off without her." "Difficult?" Sarah snapped. "She organized our family events for 10 years without complaint. She cooked for us, cleaned for us, and put up with our thoughtless comments. The one time she stood up for herself, we call her difficult." "She abandoned her family," Patricia said stubbornly. "No, she freed herself from people who took her for granted." The family was fracturing along lines that had been hidden for years. Some members supported Patricia's version of events, viewing Camille's departure as a betrayal of family loyalty. Others were beginning to understand that they'd been complicit in a system that had used and undervalued someone who'd given them nothing but kindness and service. "I miss her," Richard's youngest cousin admitted during one particularly tense gathering. "She was the only one who remembered my birthday every year. She used to send me care packages when I was in college." "She sent everyone care packages," another cousin added. "She was the one who kept us all connected." The comments highlighted what they'd all lost. Camille hadn't just been Richard's wife. She'd been the emotional center of their extended family. She'd remembered birthdays, organized celebrations, and maintained the connections that had made them feel like a unified group. Without her, they were discovering that they were just a collection of individuals with little in common beyond genetics. "Maybe we should have treated her better," someone said quietly. The admission hung in the air like a judgment none of them wanted to face. They'd had something precious, and they'd thrown it away through their own thoughtlessness and cruelty. Now they were left with the consequences of their choices, and no amount of regret could undo what they'd done. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the sound of Patricia crying quietly into her napkin. For the first time in months, she was beginning to understand exactly what she'd lost when she'd ordered that name tag. 6 months after leaving Richard's family behind, Camille was discovering what it felt like to be valued for her actual contributions rather than her willingness to serve. She sat in the conference room of the women's shelter, presenting her recommendations for streamlining their intake process to a group of directors who hung on her every word. "The current system requires women to repeat their stories multiple times to different staff members," she explained, gesturing to the flowchart on the whiteboard. "This re-traumatizes them and creates inefficiencies. My proposal consolidates intake into a single comprehensive assessment that can be shared across departments." "This is exactly what we needed," said Dr. Martinez, the shelter's executive director. "We've been struggling with this problem for years, but we didn't have the expertise to solve it." "How long would implementation take?" asked another board member. "I can have the new system operational within 6 weeks," Camille replied confidently. I'll train your staff personally and create documentation so the process can be sustained long-term. The room buzzed with excitement. These women saw her as a problem solver, a professional whose skills could transform their organization. The contrast to her previous life, where her abilities had been channeled into planning dinner parties and managing social calendars, was stark and liberating. We'd like to offer you a longer-term contract, Dr. Martinez said after the formal presentation ended. We have several other operational challenges that could benefit from your expertise. I'd be honored to continue working with you, Camille replied, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with professional satisfaction. Walking to her car after the meeting, she reflected on how much her life had changed. Her consulting business was thriving, with 3 regular clients and a waiting list of organizations that wanted her help. She was earning more money than she had in her previous job, and she was doing work that felt meaningful rather than merely functional. Her apartment had become a sanctuary rather than a stage. She'd furnished it with pieces that brought her joy rather than impressed visitors. The walls were painted in colors she loved, and the bookshelves were filled with books she'd chosen for her own pleasure rather than to signal sophistication to others. She joined a book club filled with women who valued intellectual discussion over social performance. She'd started taking pottery classes on weekends, something she'd always wanted to try but had never had time for when her schedule was consumed by other people's needs. She'd even begun dating again, though she was taking it slowly, determined to never again lose herself in someone else's expectations. Her phone rang as she reached her car. The caller ID showed her sister's name. "How did the presentation go?" Tanya asked. "Better than I hoped. They want to expand the contract." "That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." "I'm proud of me too," Camille said, surprising herself with the admission. "I forgot what it felt like to be good at something and have that recognized." "You were always good at things. You just weren't getting credit for it." It was true. For 10 years, she'd been using her organizational skills, her emotional intelligence, and her natural ability to solve problems. But she'd been using them to serve others rather than to build her own career. Now, for the first time since college, she was applying her talents to work that challenged her and provided recognition for her achievements. "Have you heard anything from Richard lately?" Tanya asked carefully. "The divorce was finalized last week. I got the papers in the mail." "How are you feeling about that?" "Relieved," Camille said, and meant it. "I thought I'd feel sad, but mostly I feel free. Like I can finally stop carrying around all that disappointment and anger." The divorce had been straightforward once she'd stopped responding to Richard's attempts at reconciliation. Her lawyer had been efficient and professional, treating the dissolution of her marriage as a business transaction rather than a personal tragedy. The lack of drama had been refreshing after years of navigating the emotional chaos of the Johnson family. "I ran into Patricia at the grocery store yesterday," Tanya said. "She looked awful. Like she'd aged 10 years in the past 6 months." "I'm sorry to hear that," Camille said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. She no longer felt anger toward her former mother-in-law, just a kind of distant pity. Patricia had destroyed her relationship with someone who genuinely cared about her, and now she was living with the consequences of that choice. "She asked about you. Whether you were okay, whether you were happy." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're thriving." Camille smiled. She was thriving, in ways that went beyond professional success. She was sleeping better, eating meals she enjoyed rather than foods chosen to please others, and rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of people-pleasing. "I'm thinking about traveling," she said. "Remember that trip to Italy we used to talk about when we were kids? You're really going to do it?" "Why not? I have the money, the time, and no one to ask permission from." The freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in her adult life, she could make decisions based purely on what would bring her joy rather than what would please others. She could travel when she wanted, eat what she liked, and pursue interests that had nothing to do with being useful to anyone else. "I think Mom would be so proud of you," Tanya said softly. Their mother had died when Camille was in college, too early to see her daughter's marriage or to offer guidance about the sacrifices that seemed expected of wives. But Camille had been thinking about her mother a lot lately, remembering the woman who'd worked full-time while raising 2 daughters, who'd never seemed to lose herself in the process of caring for others. "She always said that the most important relationship we have is with ourselves," Camille said. "I think I'm finally understanding what she meant. She also said that people will treat us exactly as badly as we allow them to. I'm done allowing it." They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, but the conversation stayed with Camille as she drove home. She'd spent 10 years allowing people to treat her as less than she was worth, convincing herself that love meant accepting whatever they offered. Now she was learning to value herself enough to demand better. Her apartment was quiet when she arrived, but it was the peaceful quiet of a space that belonged entirely to her. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her balcony, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow she would start planning her trip to Italy. Next week she would begin working with a new client who needed help reorganizing their volunteer program. Next month she would celebrate the first anniversary of her decision to value herself enough to walk away from people who didn't. The silence around her was profound, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the sound of a life being lived on her own terms, and it was beautiful. The knock on her door came on a rainy Thursday evening, just as Camille was settling in with a book and a cup of tea. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her first instinct was to ignore it. But the knocking persisted, urgent and demanding. Through the peephole, she saw Richard standing in the hallway, his hair wet from the rain, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked older than she remembered, worn down by months of living with the consequences of his choices. "Camille, please," he called through the door. "I know you're in there. I just need 5 minutes." She considered not answering, but something in his voice made her pause. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of tired curiosity about what he thought he could possibly say that would matter now. "Go away, Richard," she said through the door. "We have nothing to discuss. Please. Just 5 minutes. I need to tell you something important." Against her better judgment, she opened the door but left the chain lock engaged. Through the narrow gap, she could see him more clearly. He'd lost weight and there were dark circles under his eyes. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his tie askew. "You look terrible," she said not unkindly. "I feel terrible. I haven't been sleeping. I haven't been eating. I can't concentrate at work. I keep thinking about what I lost when you left." "What you lost?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "You didn't lose anything. You threw it away. I know that now. I know I was an idiot. I know I took you for granted. But I want to make it right. There is no making it right. The divorce is final. We're done." "I ended things with Vanessa," he said desperately. "I told her I couldn't see her anymore. I told her I was going to fight for my marriage. Your marriage ended the day you decided to support another woman while your wife played servant to your family. I know I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Camille laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Richard, you systematically deceived me for over a year. You used our joint funds to support your girlfriend while I cooked for your mother's bridge club. You stood by while your family treated me like hired help. Those weren't mistakes. Those were choices. I was confused. I didn't know what I wanted. You knew exactly what you wanted. You wanted a wife who would manage your household and entertain your family, and you wanted a girlfriend who would make you feel excited and desired. You wanted both, and you thought you could have both. The truth of it hung between them like a physical barrier. Richard had wanted the stability and convenience of marriage along with the thrill of an affair. He'd wanted Camille to continue serving his family while he pursued his own pleasure with someone else. The arrangement had worked perfectly for him until she'd refused to continue participating in it. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the name tag, for the affair, for not standing up for you. I know I hurt you." "You didn't just hurt me," Camille said. "You showed me exactly how little I meant to you. And now that I'm gone, now that your life is falling apart without me to hold it together, you want me back. I want you back because I love you. No, you want me back because you need me. There's a difference." She could see the truth of it in his face. He missed her not because he valued her as a person, but because he missed the services she'd provided. He missed coming home to a clean house and a prepared meal. He missed having someone to handle the social obligations and emotional labor that he'd never wanted to deal with himself. "My family misses you too," he said, as if this was some kind of offering. "My mother has been trying to reach you. She wants to apologize." "I don't want her apology. I don't want anything from any of you. The family reunion was a disaster. No one knew how to organize it. People were asking about you all day. That's not my problem anymore. But you were so good at it. You were the one who held us all together. I was the one who worked for free to make your family's life easier while they treated me like I was invisible." Richard's face crumpled. "I know we didn't appreciate you. I know we took advantage of your kindness. But we can change. I can change. I don't want you to change. I want you to leave me alone." "But I love you," he said again, as if repetition would make it true. "If you love me, respect my decision to build a life without you." She started to close the door, but he pressed his hand against it. "Camille, please. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut contact with my family if that's what you want. I'll do whatever it takes. I don't want you to do anything. I want you to accept that we're over and move on with your life. I can't move on. I can't imagine my life without you. Then I feel sorry for you, she said and meant it, because I can imagine my life without you just fine. In fact, I'm living it and it's wonderful. The words hit him like a physical blow. She could see the realization dawning in his eyes that she wasn't just angry or hurt. She was done. Completely, irrevocably done. You're really not coming back, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm really not coming back. What am I supposed to do without you? Learn to live with the consequences of your choices. Learn to value the people in your life before you lose them. Learn to be a better person for the next woman who's unlucky enough to trust you. There won't be a next woman. I only want you. That's not my problem anymore. She closed the door firmly and turned the deadbolt. Through the wood, she could hear him standing there for several minutes, perhaps hoping she would change her mind. But eventually, his footsteps retreated down the hallway. Camille leaned against the door, her heart pounding. The confrontation had been difficult, but also liberating. She'd said everything she needed to say, and she'd done it without anger or cruelty. She'd simply told him the truth about what he'd done and what he'd lost. Her phone rang almost immediately. Richard's name appeared on the screen, but she declined the call. Then it rang again. And again. She turned it off and set it aside. She didn't owe him any more explanations or opportunities to plead his case. She'd given him 10 years of her life and he'd wasted them. Now she was focused on the future she was building for herself. She returned to her book and her tea, but found herself thinking about the conversation. Not with regret or second thoughts, but with a kind of amazement at how far she'd come. 6 months ago, she might have been tempted by his apologies and promises. She might have convinced herself that love meant giving people endless chances to hurt her. Now she understood that love meant valuing herself enough to walk away from people who didn't value her. It meant choosing peace over drama, growth over stagnation, and self-respect over the false comfort of familiar dysfunction. The rain continued to fall outside her window, but inside her apartment, everything was warm and quiet and hers. She was exactly where she belonged, and no amount of pleading or promises could convince her to go back to being someone else's unpaid servant. The silence was beautiful and it was hers. 1 year after the wedding that changed everything, Camille stood in the Rome airport, her passport in hand and her heart full of excitement. The trip to Italy she'd planned as a symbol of her newfound freedom had become something even more meaningful, a celebration of the life she'd built entirely on her own terms. The past year had been a journey of discovery. Her consulting business had grown beyond her wildest expectations, with clients specifically seeking her out because of her reputation for transforming organizational cultures. She'd been featured in a business magazine as one of the city's most innovative consultants, and she'd been invited to speak at conferences about sustainable change management. But the professional success, satisfying as it was, wasn't the most important thing she'd gained. The most important thing was the quiet confidence that came from knowing she could trust herself to make good decisions, to set healthy boundaries, and to create a life that reflected her values rather than other people's expectations. She'd heard through mutual friends that Richard had eventually started dating again, though apparently he'd had difficulty finding someone willing to put up with his family's demands. Patricia had tried to maintain the family traditions without Camille's organizational skills, but most of the extended family had stopped attending gatherings that were poorly planned and stressful to attend. The news didn't bring her satisfaction or vindication. It simply confirmed what she'd always known, that she'd been providing valuable services that were taken for granted until they were gone. The Johnson family struggles weren't her problem anymore, and she felt no obligation to feel guilty about their inability to adapt to her absence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tanya. "Have an amazing trip. Send pictures of everything." Camille smiled and typed back, "I will. Taking off in an hour. Love you." The flight to Rome was smooth and peaceful. She had a window seat and no one to consider but herself. She read a book she'd been wanting to finish, ordered wine with dinner because she felt like it, and watched the clouds pass by below with a sense of wonder she hadn't felt in years. Italy was everything she dreamed it would be. She wandered through ancient streets, ate gelato for breakfast, and spent hours in museums admiring art that spoke to her soul. She struck up conversations with fellow travelers, met a charming Italian woman who invited her to a local festival, and discovered that she was perfectly capable of navigating a foreign country on her own. On her third day in Rome, she was sitting at a cafe near the Pantheon when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Against her better judgment, she answered. Camille? The voice was Patricia's, older and more hesitant than she remembered. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from, well, it doesn't matter how I got it. I just needed to talk to you. Patricia. Camille's voice was calm, neutral. What do you want? I wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not the half-hearted excuses I've been giving everyone else, but a real apology for what I did to you. Okay, Camille said, taking a sip of her espresso. I'm listening. The name tag was cruel. It was deliberately cruel, and I did it because I was jealous, I think. Jealous of how much my family loved you, how much they depended on you. I felt like you were taking my place as the center of the family, and I wanted to remind everyone that you were an outsider. The admission was more honest than Camille had expected. She watched people walking past the cafe, living their lives, pursuing their own happiness, and felt a strange sense of detachment from the conversation. I was never trying to take your place, Camille said. I was trying to be helpful. I was trying to be a good daughter-in-law. I know that now. I know you were just being kind, and I repaid your kindness with cruelty. I'm sorry. Thank you for saying that. Are you ever coming back? To the family, I mean. Camille laughed, but not unkindly. No, Patricia. I'm not coming back. I have my own life now. Richard is miserable. He's been miserable for months. He knows he made a terrible mistake. That's not my problem anymore. But you were so good for him. You were so good for all of us. We don't know how to function without you. Then you'll learn. Or you won't. Either way, it's not my responsibility. There was a long pause. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was small. I miss you. I know I have no right to miss you after what I did, but I do. You were the daughter I never had, and I threw it away because I was petty and small. I'm sorry you feel that way, Camille said, and meant it. But I can't be the daughter you want me to be. I can't be anyone's unpaid therapist or event planner or emotional support system. I've learned to value myself too much for that. I understand. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. That I know what I lost. I accept your apology, Patricia. But that doesn't change anything. I hope you can find peace with your choices, the same way I found peace with mine. She hung up gently and turned off her phone. The conversation had been sad but necessary, a final closing of a chapter in her life that had ended a year ago. She felt no anger toward Patricia, no desire for revenge or vindication. She simply felt free. The Italian sun was warm on her face, and she had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. She ordered another espresso and pulled out her journal, writing about the morning's adventures and planning the afternoon's exploration. Tomorrow she would take the train to Florence. Next week she would fly to Paris. Next month she would return home to her thriving business and the life she'd built from scratch. For the first time in her adult life, she was living entirely for herself. Not in a selfish way, but in a way that honored her own needs and desires. She was learning what it meant to be truly free, not just from bad relationships but from the need to please others at the expense of her own happiness. A year ago, she'd been a woman who defined herself by how well she served others. Now she was a woman who defined herself by how well she cared for herself. The transformation had been gradual but profound, and she knew there was no going back. She finished her espresso and walked toward the Pantheon, her steps light and purposeful. She had a whole day ahead of her, a whole life ahead of her, and for the first time in years she couldn't wait to see what came next. The ancient building rose before her, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of creating something lasting. She thought about the life she was building, the relationships she was cultivating, the work she was doing. All of it was on her own terms, all of it was chosen rather than imposed. She entered the Pantheon and looked up at the oculus, the opening in the dome that let in the light. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She had found her own opening, her own way to let the light in. And she was never going back to the darkness. The silence in the ancient space was profound, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the sound of a life being lived authentically, and it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. Standing there in Rome, surrounded by centuries of history and possibility, Camille smiled. She was exactly where she belonged, and no one could ever take that away from her again.